Hi everyone. Can you hear me okay? Oh. It's a real honor to be standing up here. It's been such a great conference. This is my first one of these conferences. And it's such a beautiful spirit here, and I've seen so many fantastic talks and met great people. So I feel very privileged to be standing up here. If I'm honest, I don't feel entirely worthy to be standing up here doing a keynote talk. I was very honored that Paul asked me. Not just being modest, that's just how I feel. But I think it's also partly because what I'm going to talk about, it's not really based on research I've personally done. It's just been my attempt to understand and synthesize the literature I've been reading. But I suppose there's value in that. I'm a big fan of Ken Wilber. I don't know how he's regarded in these circles, but his approach is to try and draw together lots of different people's work and provide an overarching way of understanding it. I really appreciate what he does with vast amounts of literature. So I've tried to do something similar with respect to the work I've found since becoming involved with positive psychology. So as David said in the introduction, this talk is about the dialectics of well-being. You could say it's also more broadly about PP 2.0, or what we call the second wave of positive psychology. I'm a lecturer in positive psychology at the University of East London. So I'm going to give you my take on where I see the field as having come from, where it is, and where it's going. So I don't really do research into meaning, but I've got an existential type question to kick things off with, because you're probably wondering, who is this odd guy standing up here talking? So I'd just like to let you know a bit about myself, partly just so you know who I am, but also because I feel, often scholarship is in large part a reflection of the person who does it, their background, their history, their story, and so on. So I just want to mention a few things about my past, my life, that is relevant to what I want to talk about today, because it feeds into the way in which I've personally approached positive psychology and then this idea of the second wave. So I suppose the first thing to mention that's relevant is before I went to university, when I was 19, I went to China to teach English in the beautiful city of Qingdao, if anyone knows that. So I spent 6 months there and traveled around a lot and visited lots of Buddhist and Taoist monasteries. I mean, the trip was very mind-blowing in lots of ways, expanding my horizon emotionally and physically. Also intellectually, I was encountering all these fascinating ideas relating to person and the mind and well-being and life and so on. And just really having this sense that there was many systems of the mind developed in other cultures that weren't necessarily found in my own culture. And then this sense was reinforced when I went to university in Scotland to study psychology. And, it's a comprehensive course, but there was a sense that much was missing based on what I'd encountered in China, ideas relating to Buddhism and Taoism, and just this sense that psychology, as I was studying it, was relatively Western-centric, and there was much to be gained from engaging with other cultures and their insights into the mind. That's one of the things that's, I guess, fed into my work, my scholarship here. So then, I did my degree in Edinburgh, which is a beautiful city, if anyone's been there. And then I spent another strange 6 years. I mentioned this in my brief talk yesterday, but trying to be a musician, doing okay, but not making much money. So I spent 6 years doing music, but at the same time, to make some money on the side, I was working in a psychiatric hospital as a nursing assistant. And then that was just strange and important work to me. It was very intense, and a lot of the experiences were, on the face of it, kind of negative, but also deeply meaningful. So I'm not trained as a nurse, so I wasn't dispensing medicines or anything. I was just being with patients. I would take them walking around the grounds if they needed to be escorted, or I'd sit with them if they were at risk of self-harm and try and make sure they were okay, or just have a chat with them, sitting and having coffee and all these sorts of things. And so lots of the shifts, I would experience these kind of intense emotions that were quite often unpleasant, like real sadness at their situation. But then at the same time, that sadness made me, really reach out in compassion to them, and it felt important that I was experiencing that and being there with them. Like I would feel like states of anger at the psychiatric system and society more generally. But that made me, this anger wasn't unproductive either. It made me want to advocate for them or try and affect change more generally in some way. So that had its value. And even other things like, sometimes I was just very bored. Like one time it was supposed to be a locked ward, but the door wasn't locked, so I just had to sit there, make sure no one went out, and I was just sitting there, and you have lots of hours just doing nothing because you're not supposed to read. So just sitting there, and it was very boring. But then out of that boredom, I got lots of creative ideas, for example. So even out of that state came interesting, I suppose, insights and so on. So experiencing what you could see as negative emotions, but then there was value and meaning in them, and that was very influential. So after that, I did my PhD, focusing on meditation. And then after I finished the PhD, I got a job as a lecturer in positive psychology at the University of East London. And then I was trying to get to grips with a new field because my PhD was related to it because it was on the broad subject of well-being, but I hadn't really engaged much with positive psychology writings, as it were, scholars identified with positive psychology. So I came in it relatively fresh, and I suppose this idea of the second wave was just rose out of my engagement with this literature and how I felt about it. So I'm going to talk about this notion of waves, because Paul has the notion of PP 2.0, which is very influential, and in fact we've just drawn on his work. But I do also like the metaphor of the wave as well, because it's quite dynamic and organic, and I think it's a natural process that fields do change and evolve. And then also when they do so, it doesn't negate what went before, and I think it's important I say that, because it can be mischaracterized as if we're dismissing things that have happened before, but that's not the intention. So I'll go into that more later on. But this idea of waves, I think, is important. So there's what you might think of as the first wave of positive psychology. This was positive psychology as initially formed and instantiated and propagated by Seligman and his colleagues. So you may or may not know the story. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this kind of narrative. But the essence was that psychology as usual, on the whole, had a very negative bias. So focusing on disorder and dysfunction and distress. And that's obviously not the whole story. There's pockets of scholarship, particularly humanistic scholarship, that focused on flourishing and development. But on the whole, the idea was that psychology as a field really didn't pay much attention to topics like happiness and well-being and flourishing. And I think that was a fair characterization. So when Seligman instantiated the field in the late 90s, that was such an important and welcome move. So I really kind of applaud and respect that he did that, because it was important to bring these topics into the mainstream to give them a certain validity that they may have lacked in some people's eyes. So I think that was a really important move that he did, to make this focus on topics and qualities and emotions that we might see as being positive. But then when you do that, it creates these kind of strange dynamics, and instantly you're creating this sort of inevitable polarization, because if it's founded on the notion of the positive, you're saying that certain things are positive, certain qualities and emotions and so on, which inevitably makes other things negative. And that's fine, because you can use positive and negative in various ways. So you might say, well, certain things are positively valence, they feel good, and other things are negatively valence and feel bad. So we have pleasant and unpleasant. But often other processes become involved. So we're not just saying something is positively valence, but it almost takes on a normative character. So this is not just positively valence, but it's positive in merit and the moral worth, and we should feel like this, and we ought to go towards this. So certain things are desirable and to be sought, and conversely, then other things are characterized as negative and then undesirable and then to be avoided, and then this leads to other, discourses like negative things might even be considered pathological or wrong, and we shouldn't be feeling like this. And that's it's an uncomfortable discourse. I personally found uncomfortable, for example, based on my experiences like working in the hospital and some of the things I was feeling that had value and had meaning. And I wasn't prepared to just say that these should be avoided. States like anger and sadness and boredom, there was value and meaning in them. So I wasn't just happy to say, these are negative, let's try and move away from them. They may even be wrong. So I wanted to kind of get past that. And also, this notion of the second wave also came out of conversations with peers. See, there's Worth over there, you know, and he said something very meaningful in one of our first meetings about some of his students. They were going through a tough time, and during that tough time, they felt as if positive psychology wasn't for them at that time. And we were saying that's a real shame if they felt that there was almost this obligation to be positive, and if you weren't feeling bright and positive, then you should step away from the field for a moment. And we felt that was a shame, didn't we? So ideas like that kind of were feeding into this emergence of this idea of the second wave. Yeah, because it's a troubling discourse in a way, because it can portray negativity as somehow wrong and even pathological. You know, and there's almost an implicit blame on people who are feeling negative. You know, you sometimes see those quotes like, cut negative people out of your life, right? Have you seen that sort of thing? And on one hand, I get it, because, you know, there's an ethic of like self-preservation, and, you know, you only have one life, so you don't want to be around negativity. But then you think, well, what about the people who are negative and they're suffering, and how about we can't just cut them off and cut them loose? So it's a kind of tricky thing where you start to portray negative feelings as being wrong and to be eschewed. Almost like there's an implicit blame on you or other people if they're feeling negative. So it kind of almost can create an additional burden if we see this negativity as wrong. But for example, there's an idea in Buddhism called the 2 arrows. So if you're feeling a negative emotion, that's the first arrow, and that may be bad enough. But then feeling bad about feeling bad, the sense that you shouldn't be feeling bad, is the second arrow, and that could be doubly wounding, as it were. So this idea of positive is good and should be sought, and negative is bad and should be avoided, it's a bit of a difficult discourse. And arguably it also oversimplifies the dialectics of well-being, which is what I'd like to talk to you today. So out of these criticisms, well, following on from Paul's work, we've kind of created this, identified this literature that we're calling the second wave. So it's interesting because what I'm going to talk about could be seen as a critique of the first wave, and in a way it is. But then some people say, well, would that not just undermine positive psychology? And I don't think that's the case. The focus is still on happiness, flourishing, well-being. So it's still positive psychology. But I think in a kind of dialectical process, it's an evolution of the first wave. So it's not a refutation of it, but it's just a movement on from it, which is why I think it's valuable to still call ourselves positive psychologists working in positive psychology, and why this constitutes a second wave. So it's still working with happiness and well-being. Still a smiley face, right? But there's like different colors in there. So there's various ways of characterizing the second wave. For me, the key term is this notion of dialectics. So dialectics in itself is, you know, it's a complex, loaded term, and it has different meanings. But I suppose the key meaning here is just this tension or dynamic relationship between opposites. And that plays out in lots of different ways in the literature we've identified in speaking of this second wave. Obviously, you have Taoist yin-yang symbol, which I'm going to come back to, because this could be regarded as the kind of ultimate dialectical symbol of this interaction between opposites. So I'm going to come back to Taoism in a bit. But in thinking about second wave and the literature that we think forms the basis of the second wave, can identify maybe 4 main principles. You know, interesting to find principles. Principle of presence, covalence, complementarity, and evolution. So I'm just going to touch upon each of these relatively quickly to give a sense of this field. I'm trying to keep a track of the time. All right. Principle appraisal. So this is the idea that an a priori characterization of something as either positive or negative is tricky. And you find that, not to sound too paradoxical, but positive can be negative. Things we think of as positive can actually be ultimately negative. Vice versa, things that seem negative can be positive. And that sounds like a paradox, but it's sort of not really. The difference becomes between, there's different ways we can use the term positive and negative. And at least 2 main ways are differentiating between valence and utility. So something can have a positive or negative valence, which means it feels good or bad, pleasant or unpleasant. And that's different from the issue of whether it has a positive or negative utility or outcome, whether it's ultimately beneficial to our well-being. So here's where you can find that, and I'll come on to examples of this, but something that might have a positive valence, feels good, might actually be counterproductive to our well-being, so has a negative utility. And vice versa, something that has a negative valence may have a positive outcome. So that's where you get the seeming paradox, but it's sort of not really. It just depends on how you use the terms positive and negative. And ultimately, these judgments, these assignations, then depend on context. A lot of it depends on context. So I just want to run through a few different dichotomies, I suppose, just to show how this can indeed be happening. Like positive can be negative, negative can be positive. So, for example, optimism and pessimism. You know, it's standard to call optimism positive and pessimism negative. You know, and largely that's true, and at least in terms of valence, that's pretty much always the case. Optimism feels good, pessimism feels bad. But it can be the case that optimism can be self-defeating and hinder our well-being, and pessimism or forms of adaptive anxiety could be useful. And here I should point out, actually, that the founders of positive psychology were aware of this. Just, again, to go back to the point that I'm not suggesting we're reinventing the wheel or dismissing what went before, because, for example, Seligman, in his book on optimism, back in the 1990s, said you've got to be aware of the tyrannies of optimism and be able to use pessimism as a keen sense of reality when we need it. So these ideas are present implicitly in the field from the start, and now they're just becoming explicit with the second wave, I would suggest. So this idea that, for example, what's been called excessive or overweening optimism can be harmful in some ways, for example, leading to, difficult appraisals around risk. So kind of an oversense of optimism might mean you to take risks, whereas a kind of a lesser degree of optimism would mean you'll be more cautious. So there's studies associating excessive optimism, as it were, with health risk behaviors like smoking and so on. So conversely, you can flip that round, and then levels of adaptive pessimism or anxiety can actually be useful and productive. So there's some good work here, for example, by Julie Norum, and she talks about the positive power of negative thinking. And in a way, it's kind of common sense, and it's thinking about anticipating challenges, anticipating obstacles, and so on. This is a form of pessimism. You're thinking about what could go wrong, but in a way that's actually productive, because it means you might plan, make contingency plannings, do this kind of proactive coping. But there's a really nice example. Do you know Chris Hadfield? Now we're in Canada, a great Canadian astronaut. And so he's got his great autobiography, and in it he has a section on the positive power of negative thinking, because he takes issue with this notion that you could, for example, envisage, that these practices around envisaging a successful outcome. And he said in his NASA training, they did the reverse, where they were essentially anticipating to the nth degree everything that could go wrong, But it's not a kind of exercise in pessimism, but more just if you anticipate what could go wrong, then you put training in place to plan for it. And he said then develop this armor against anxiety because you've planned for anything that could go wrong. So it's kind of harnessing the power of thinking negatively, as it were, but for a beneficial outcome. So that's the first dichotomy. The second one, and this does touch upon some existential themes here too, so the distinction between freedom and restriction. So it's common to think of freedom as a positive and restriction as a negative, but there's lots of literature, philosophical, psychological, around some of the issues with what you might call an excessive freedom and then the value of some form of restriction. So obviously, complete restriction is a kind of horror, as it were, but again, this untrammeled freedom can be troubling. So you think about existential philosophers like Sartre saying mankind is born condemned to be free, and Kierkegaard's notion of the dizziness of choice, because if there's unlimited possibilities, then we have to make a choice and take responsibility for the consequences. So this notion that if anything's possible, it can be troubling. And there's other things like Dostoevsky, if everything's allowed, everything can be permitted. If there's no restrictions upon us. And you can find psychological work too, touching upon this theme. So I don't know if you know this interesting study by someone called Schwartz about consumer choice. Because we're often led to this idea that, you know, choice is good, more choice is better. But he did a study, details don't matter too much here, but it involved selections of jam in a supermarket, and he varied the selections, and then people who bought their jam from a wider selection were ultimately more dissatisfied with their choice. Because he had a selection like 26, and then he rotated it, and then a selection with just 6, varied by hour. And then so people who bought their jam from the bigger selection were ultimately more dissatisfied with their choice than those who bought it from the smaller selection. You know, there's various reasons why that might be. There's greater reason to think, did I make the right choice when there's more selection there? So just this notion that choice is good, but more choice isn't necessarily better. You know, and then you can flip that round, the value of imposing limitations on ourselves. Like various examples come to mind. But so, for example, you think about monastery living, you know, imposing restrictions on what to eat and what to wear and what to do at any given time. And it's inherently limiting, but the value in that is to kind of free us from the burden of having to make these incessant daily choices that don't really mean that much, and to free the mind to, you know, have higher pursuits. Or even just having an exercise routine. You know, we're imposing a routine upon our existence, so we're not just free to follow our whims at any given time, and then that can be useful. So the value of self-imposing limitations in serving an ultimate well-being. So another interesting dichotomy where acceptance and forgiveness, say on the one hand, versus anger. You know, we're often taught that acceptance and forgiveness is good, and oftentimes it is, but you can find research that challenges that view gently. So, for example, work by McNulty and Fincham on forgiveness in the context of abusive or coercive relationships, and this notion that it can sometimes be problematic if it means you will tolerate a status quo that you might otherwise fight against. So this notion that being overly forgiving or accepting can be detrimental in some way, and it's obviously not victim blaming, but they're just trying to point out the fact that it sometimes means people will acquiesce to a situation which, if they were less tolerant, they might hopefully be able to resist or escape in some way. And so flipping that around, something like anger, well, anger's problematic. It feels like we're in a really angry age. So I don't want to say anger's good, and sometimes anger can be egotistical and just degenerate into hatred. But there is a literature around the fact that anger can be useful sometimes. So Carol Tavris, for example, she suggests that anger can often, not always, but often be a moral emotion. It's a sign within that there's some ethic has been breached. So it's a warning signal that not all is right in the world, and if we feel this anger, it can be difficult to deal with and can degenerate into hate, which is going to be corrosive. But the notion that anger can be a productive pro-social force is found in the literature. So this idea that it can motivate progressive social movements, for example, the civil rights movement or feminism. This was anger at the state of society, but that anger, you know, yes, it felt unpleasant, but it was this great driver of progressive social change. So again, we're just playing with the notion that positive and negative is hard to say here. You know, if anger gives rise to a particular progressive social movement, is that anger positive or negative? I mean, it's negative and it feels unpleasant, surely, but it may be positive in the outcomes it leads to. And then even happiness and sadness itself, you can critique this polarity. So, I mean, taking happiness, there's literature around happiness in some way being problematic. So there's various ways of coming at this, but the pursuit of happiness, for example, can be tricky. You know, this notion that we're seeking something that we don't currently have, from some perspectives, that very act of seeking creates the dissatisfaction we hope to alleviate. We're saying not all is right with how things are. I'm going to pursue this other state of happiness, and then that the space between what is and what we seek is the dissatisfaction we're trying to alleviate. So this notion of seeking happiness can be problematic. Then also, even if we feel happy, you know, there can be issues there too, right? Issues, I mean, for example, the notion of false consciousness, and we can be beguiled into thinking our current level of happiness is all there is to experience, that we might be misled by, for example, consumer capitalist society, say everything's okay as it is, whereas actually there could be many higher forms of happiness that we could seek and find. And then we can flip that around and say something like sadness. You know, no one wants to feel sad, but it can have its value and its function. So there's a literature around sadness having a role to play in living a full and fulfilling life. So it can serve a protective function, for example, almost as a form of psychological pain, just whereas physical pain causes us to kind of withdraw from a noxious stimuli and to protect ourselves, as if sadness can have an equivalent psychological function. You know, it's also associated with sensitivity and compassion and caring, being attuned to the nature of the world and being wanting to reach out and make things better. And then also you can have an aesthetic sensibility as well. The fact that it's important for us to be moved by art, moved by the world. There's a sadness inherent in that, but it's a sadness that I think most people would find important and valuable. So that's the principle of appraisal, just taking this idea that it's hard to categorize some things as strictly positive or negative. And it depends on context, and it depends upon the meaning, and it depends upon whether we're talking about valence or outcome. So in all of those cases, in each case, the valence is as we would expect it to be. Optimism feels good, pessimism feels bad, but the outcome may be counter to that. So the second principle is what we call the principle of covalence. So this is not just the fact that it's difficult to categorize something as positive or negative, but that many emotions and important experiences are a complex blend of light and dark. So I want to give you some examples of this. So, for example, there's some interesting work around ambivalent emotions, and I've done a bit of my own research on this, which I'm going to introduce quickly. But this idea that some emotions are a compound of positive and negative valence at the same time. And there's different types. You can have sequential ambivalent emotions where positive is followed quickly by negative, and then you go through cycles. But then also simultaneous ambivalent emotions where it's positive and negative at the same time, which makes, there's an interesting point there about the affect system. Arguably it's not a spectrum, but it's a bivariate space. They're functionally independent, so you can feel positive and negative at the same time. So I'll just give you a few quick examples just to change the tone here, because as David mentioned, I've been engaged in this project to collect untranslatable words. So untranslatable words are those that we lack an equivalent for in our own language. And I'll give you some examples now. So I'm creating a collection, and then not just to create a list, but of these words, I've been conducting a thematic analysis to create what you might see as a map of well-being, different dimensions in different areas. If you're interested, there's a couple of books, an academic one and a non-academic one. This is the map I've been creating. It's a work in progress. It's like an emergent map. Broadly speaking, I've identified 6 main categories, grouped into 3 meta-categories. So there's feelings, relationships, and development. Relationships involves love and pro-sociality. Development involves spirituality and character. And here I want to focus on feelings, because there's feelings that you would readily identify as positive, i.e. positively valenced. But then also there's an interesting category of ambivalent feelings, which are in some way a mix of positive and negative valence. So this map, it's granular, the way Google Maps is. You can zoom in on different areas. So I'm going to zoom in on this ambivalent emotions, or ambivalent feelings. And here has 5 themes, and each of these themes is comprised of various untranslatable words which are not equivalent to one another, so it brings nuance within each of those themes. So we have a theme of hope and anticipation, longing, pathos, appreciation of imperfection, and sensitivity to mystery. So I'm going to quickly go through these themes, partly because I've found some nice images to show them, and also just to get a feel for what that theme is. So the theme of hope and anticipation, one of the words there is magari, an Italian word, which I know the irony of trying to translate an untranslatable word here, but roughly speaking, it refers to a sense of, well, can mean just maybe, kind of prosaically, but there's also a sense of being like a hopeful wish, wistful regret, in my dreams, if only. Because hope is a strange thing, and it is positive, I would say, but it's also ambivalent, because there's always that element of doubt or insecurity. Because if there wasn't, it would just be certainty. But the fact that we're hoping for something means we're not entirely sure. So there's a strange ambivalence there, and it's captured by this word. And then also, just to get a further sense of this word, for each of these words I've been trying to find haikus to illustrate it. Partly just because, I don't know, this is a bit of a tangent, but I'm really trying to kind of mix modalities here. I think it's great if I can try and bring in some artistic expressions to help us kind of get under the spirit of these things. If I had longer, and I did this in the workshop, I'd have you all compose your own haiku, but we don't have time for that. But you still could, after the event. So I know what you're thinking. Haikus normally are 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, but apparently you can play with the form a bit, so this one doesn't quite conform to type. But all my haikus I found are by Basho, arguably the foremost proponent of the art. So he's written this one, which I thought reflects nicely this theme of hope. Moonlit plum tree, wait, spring will come. So that's the theme of hope. Second theme is longing. So longing is really interesting, and I heard one definition describe this as a blend of the primary emotions of happiness and sadness. Fundamentally ambivalent, There's happiness present in as much as we have things that we care for and love, but there's sadness in as much as that we're removed from them for some reason. So here I found this term, Sehnsucht, a German term, that sort of describes a pining for longing. So not just that we long for something, but we have a tendency towards longing. So it's almost like this ambivalent utopian dreaminess, where there's a bittersweet sense that the world is incomplete and not as good as it should be, but we long for better futures, for alternative states, alternative ways of being. The Sehnsucht character, as a term within this theme of longing. Another haiku. How I long to see among dawn flowers the face of God. The third theme, I call this theme pathos, because pathos is strange. We're moved by the world, essentially. So I spoke about being moved is a strange experience. It is sad, but it's important, and arguably life wouldn't be complete unless we were moved by it in some way. So one of the terms I found for this was a Japanese term called mono no oware, which is important within Zen Buddhism, for example. A sensitivity to the ephemerality of the world. Because various speakers have touched upon the idea of impermanence within Buddhist thought and the importance of coming to appreciate and even understand and even appreciate this notion of fragility, finitude, impermanence. So this is why the symbol of this is the cherry blossoms, because they're so evanescent, they appear so briefly and then they fade after a couple of weeks. But arguably, it's the very fact of their transiency that heightens their beauty in a way that, if they were just there the whole time, you wouldn't appreciate them quite so much, you'd habituate to them. So their transiency almost elevates and heightens their beauty. So this captures this theme of this concept of mono no oware. This is regarded as typical of the mood by Basho. Summer grasses, the only remains a warrior's dream. That theme and that concept is then counterbalanced by this fourth theme, which I call this theme the appreciation of imperfection. And here I'm illustrating it with the term wabi-sabi. I don't know if that's familiar to anyone. So mono no oware, it involves the passing of time and the transiency of life. But then this is a counterpart recognizing the fact that in that passing of time, in that transiency, phenomena, people do persist. They change over time, but it's still the same being, the same process that goes through these changes. And that in this process of changing, a certain grace and beauty and dignity is retained. So that's why images of this concept are an old tree in winter, for example, like a ruined castle. It's this notion that even as things change and age and weather and decay, there's depth and meaning and beauty in that change. And that's, and then you can think about how that, applies to humans and their own self-aging and development. So the aesthetics of impermanence and imperfection. So again, it's bittersweet, it's ambivalent, covalence. Solitary now, standing amid the blossoms, is a cypress tree. And the final one, I've called this theme sensitivity to mystery. There's a few terms within there, particularly this third Japanese term, yugen, It's often held up with Mono Owari and Wabi Sabi as kind of an important perceptual emotional mood within Zen Buddhism. If you read Alan Watts, for example, he talks about these three. And this is a sense of obscurity and impenetrability and unknowability and mystery. Essentially a sensitivity to the mystery of existence. And being just moved by this mystery, which is ineffable and unknowable, but we can somehow see glimmers. And those glimmers move us, and we're not quite sure why. So these are, important ambivalent emotions. They are, covalence, to use the terminology I've been going with here. Hard to pin them down. There's a mixture of light and dark within them, and then it's important. And, because when we say ambivalent, in common parlance, it's kind of almost a synonym for I don't really care, it's kind of wishy-washy, there's not much going on. But actually this shows that it can be ambivalent because there's intensely positive and intensely negative at the same time, all wrapped up together. So for this one, on a withered branch, a crow is perched in the autumn evening. And I'm going to finish off here in talking about covalence with love, because this is arguably one of the most cherished experiences and emotions we have in life. But then thinking about this is inherently covalence. There's real intermingling of many feelings, highs and lows. And as I'll come on to that, highs and lows are inseparable, and it's what creates the intensity of love. So I found a few nice quotes illustrating this point, this covalence nature. So C.S. Lewis, in The Four Loves, he wrote, "To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken." Zygmunt Bauman, he wrote a book on love, said, "To love means opening to that most sublime of all human conditions, one in which fear blends with joy into an alloy that no longer allows its ingredients to separate." And I'm sure you all know Khalil Gibran, and his verse includes the lines, "When love beckons to you, follow him, though his ways are hard and steep. And when his wings enfold you, yield to him, though the sword hidden among his pinions may wound you." So this idea that love is an intensely covalent experience. It involves these highs and lows and these lights and darks. But this leads me to the third principle, the principle of complementarity, because it's not just the fact that if you're in love, you might happen to feel these negative emotions, but they're all an intimate part of the experience. It's the very fact that you love someone so intensely that makes you worry about them, and makes you miss them when they're not around and when you're separated from them, and if you didn't, they're two sides of the same coin, almost like the price tag you've got to pay to be in love is to have these senses of missing someone or worrying someone, but that's just the price you pay for having the joy of being with them, and it's all part of the two sides of the same coin. So it's not just that it's covalence, but they're co-creating and complementary. And so this is, I suppose, speaks to a larger principle too, when we're speaking about positive and negative. With many of these dichotomies, so not just love, but other things, the two poles of the continuum, whether it's, let's say, optimism and pessimism, for example, they're co-creating, codependent. And this applies not just to emotions, but to other things, so high and low, left and right, light and dark. The existence of one creates the existence of the other. You can't just have high and no low. I'm just going to have left and no right. Identifying one creates the other, and this is how they become co-creating, codependent. So this is, of course, like the insight of Taoism millennia ago. Which is why I had the yin-yang symbol at the beginning, and this is a central pillar of Taoist thought, this codependence of opposites. And the fact that when you identify one side of a dichotomy, it brings the other side into being, as it were. So the Tao Te Ching, it says, when the people of the world all know beauty as beauty, there arises the recognition of ugliness. When they all know good as good, there arises the recognition of evil. But within Taoism, it's not simply just saying that there's this static pairs of opposites, but there's also this idea that it's a dynamic process. And that's why the yin-yang symbol has a fleck of dark in the light and vice versa. This idea that opposites can even transform into one another in a dynamic process. And one example is, think about the sun. And when the sun reaches its meridian at its highest point, it begins its descent into night. So there's this constant process of change and dynamic progression. So it's not a static picture. But at the same time, it is recognizing codependence of these different opposites. Those are the first three principles. And then the last principle, this applies to, I think, the field itself. We'll call this the principle of evolution, because I mentioned that the word dialectic has different meanings. So one of the meanings, one of the most meanings commonly associated with it, is that given to it by Hegel, George Hegel, the philosopher. And he talked about this process of dialectic, where you have a thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So a thesis is, well, it could be anything, like a proposition. And then the counter-argument is the antithesis. So let's say I say all people are good. That's a thesis. The antithesis is to say all people are bad. So you have the thesis, it gets critiqued. That critique is the antithesis. But what's interesting in his process of dialectic is then the antithesis gets critiqued. But that doesn't then you just go back to the thesis. You move on to a higher level where there's a synthesis of both thesis and antithesis. So in the case of that proposition, it's like, yeah, well, there's good and bad in people. So I think you can see something of this process involved in positive and first and second wave positive psychology. You might say psychology as usual was the thesis. That's the status quo that we found in the 90s. So the antithesis to that was positive psychology. It said, no, we need to kind of just focus on the negative. We need to focus on the positive. And that was an important and necessary move made by Seligman and colleagues. They made that move and they did great work in establishing the field, which was really important. And then once they'd done that, this opened the space for critique of that move. So a critique of this antithesis. But this is the point I was trying to make about not negating what they did, because that was just a necessary step. And then once they'd done that, once they'd established the importance of focusing on the positive, then we could critique the notion of the positive. But we couldn't critique it from the start, because then the field would just gone nowhere and dissipated. So they established the field, put them on a firm footing. Then people like myself and following on from Paul, then we can come in and critique the notion of the positive in the ways I've been trying to do in this talk. But then that doesn't just mean doing away with first wave or just going back to psychology as usual, but rather trying to preserve the best of both. So keep the ethos of positive psychology, but accommodate the criticisms. So arguably the synthesis is the second wave. But then the journey keeps going, because in this whole process, the synthesis then becomes a thesis for a new process. So soon there'll be an antithesis, perhaps a third wave of positive psychology, whatever that will involve, and then a fourth, fifth. So we'll keep on going. I think it's this process of, that's what I like the wave metaphor, as I suggested. It's this process of organic development, growth, evolution that a field goes through. So I've tried to capture some of the literature that I think contributes to this second wave. Some of the ways I've been looking at it, and there's other ways of looking at it. My colleague Itai he emphasizes slightly different aspects, the importance of, for example, engaging with one's shadow and challenging emotions in terms of self-development, and Paul's contribution, which brings in other elements too, like an importance of focusing on other cultures, which I've done implicitly here, but I think Paul is doing that more explicitly, different kind of cross-cultural sensitivity and awareness, and bringing that into the fold. So there's different ways in which the second wave might be considered to be unfolding. This is just one way, and I think different people are interpreting it in different ways. But I think it's still fair to say there is some kind of movement happening there with this second wave, and then this will be challenged and critiqued, and then that will form the third wave, perhaps. So we'll see where it goes. So thank you for listening.